Hello everyone, welcome to Inconvenient Truth by Jennifer Zeng. If you are following me on Twitter, you might have seen me tweet a lot of videos lately about the Mongolia people's protests against the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP's decision to cancel Mongolia language instruction in Mongolia schools. I called it cultural genocide in my first tweet. What happened exactly? Why would the CCP do such a thing? Does the CCP intend to replace Mongolia language and culture with Chinese language and culture? If I say that the CCP has long since launched a cultural genocide on the Chinese language and culture too, would that make sense to you? If not, please don't go away. I will explain later about this very important issue that many people fail to realize. First, let me briefly talk about the latest situation in Inner Mongolia or Southern Mongolia. On August 26, the Mongolia government's Department of Education announced that starting from the new school year on September 1st, all primary and secondary schools in Inner Mongolia will begin to use Chinese language teaching materials. The government explained that, quote, General Secretary Xi Jinping pointed out that education is a major national and party project. The construction of teaching materials is of national importance. Therefore, the party has established the National Textbook Committee in July 2017 to further strengthen the management and use of teaching materials in universities, primary and secondary schools, and colleges as a national initiative and a set of national standardized teaching materials for 3 subjects, including Chinese language, politics, also called ethics and the rule of law, and history, was created and put in use since September 2017 in all primary and secondary schools in China as well as in Xinjiang. In 2018, schools in Tibet also started to adopt these standardized teaching materials in Chinese. And from September 1st this year, ethnic schools in 6 provinces, including Inner Mongolia, Gansu, Jilin, Liaoning, Qinghai, and Sichuan, are also required to adopt these textbooks. The CCP has made it very clear, and I quote, textbooks embody the will of the party and the state, reflect the major concerns of the people, preserve China's outstanding culture and the advanced achievement of human civilization, and are an important vehicle for resolving the fundamental questions of what kind of people to nurture, how to nurture them, and to whom to nurture them. Textbooks have a direct bearing on the implementation of the party's education policy and the realization of educational goals, unquote. So, to put it in simple language, textbooks and education in school must serve the party and the party's needs. Although the CCP claims that the current bilingual instruction system will not change, and apart from the first grade of primary school and secondary school, students in other grades can continue to get instructions in both ethnic languages, including Mongolia and Korean language, so the schools are still having bilingual system. However, as the first grade student can only study the standardized Chinese language textbooks from now on, several years later, after the current students from grade 2 to grade 6 graduate, all students will be studying Chinese language textbooks only. And then, after several decades or sooner, perhaps nobody will know how to speak Mongolia language anymore, and the language and culture will gradually die out. That's how serious it is. If you understand the above, you will understand why large-scale protests have broken out in many cities in Inner Mongolia. Tens of thousands of students and parents launched strikes and protests. Some schools forced students to take classes, while brave students stormed out of the school as a protest. At one school in Tongliao City, a student jumped to her death after being shot inside the school and seeing her mom beaten by the police. Video clips show that military armored vehicles appeared on the street of Inner Mongolia. Students got arrested by the CCP police, and some shops are not allowed to sell Mongolia language books. In the meantime, the CCP ordered all cadres and employees to send their children to school. A comprehensive investigation needs to be conducted to find out who hasn't sent their children to school. Those who don't will be punished. The latest news gathered from a meeting at the Inner Mongolia University was 1. The order to cancel Mongolia language education is from CCP's head Xi Jinping himself. 2. The CCP thinks, as usual, that the protests in Inner Mongolia were induced by anti-China separatists outside the country. Those who collaborate with foreign forces need to be arrested. 3. It is prohibited to mention that bilingual education is unconstitutional. 4. The relevant regulations in the Constitution will be amended in the future. By the way, the CCP keeps amending the Constitution all the time. 5. Everyone must accept the bilingual education unconditionally. 6. All forms of protest must stop. As I mentioned earlier, Inner Mongolia is not the first and only target of the CCP's cultural genocide. The so-called standardized Chinese language textbooks have already been adopted in Xinjiang and Tibet in 2017 and 2018. Only the outside world didn't know much about it. Several days ago, on August 28th to 29th, the CCP held its 6th Tibet Work Forum in Beijing. Xi Jinping made an important speech in which he said, and I quote, "We must adhere to the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, the socialism system with Chinese characteristics, and the system of regional autonomy," unquote. He also stressed that the CCP needed to strengthen education and guidance for the masses, widely mobilize them to participate in the anti-secession struggle, and form a brass wall to maintain stability, to carry out in-depth education on the history of the party, the new China, reform and opening up, and the development of socialism, as well as on the relationship between Tibetan regions and the motherland, which means China, and guide the masses of all ethnic groups to establish a correct outlook on the country, history, ethnicity, culture, and religion, unquote. He also said that we should actively guide Tibetan Buddhism to adapt to a socialist society and promote the Chinesization of Tibetan Buddhism. We all know that since the CCP's occupation of Tibet in the 1950s, hundreds of thousands, some say as many as 1.2 million Tibetans have been killed. Religious persecution has never stopped, and the cruelty is astonishing. In Mongolia, mass killing and persecution have also happened frequently. In the so-called Inner Mongolia incident during 1967 to 1969, over 1 million people were categorized as members of the already dissolved Inner Mongolia People's Revolutionary Party. Tens of thousands were killed. Methods of torture were most terrifying: branding with hot irons, feeding furnace wastes, removing livers, hanging, cutting tongues and noses, piercing nails, piercing vaginas, pouring hot saline waters into wounds, etc., were all applied to Mongolians. When I lived in Australia years ago, I met Professor Yuan Hongbin, who was born and grew up in Inner Mongolia. He personally saw such a scene in the village, and I personally heard him telling this story. During the Inner Mongolia incident, several CCP soldiers had an old Mongolian man on the tree with his 2 hands and 2 legs tied together from behind. Underneath this old man was a big iron pot with a diameter of nearly 2 meters. The soldiers burned the empty iron pot until it was red, then slowly lowered the man closer and closer to the pot, then pushed open his clothes and exposed his naked belly to the burning red pot. Then suddenly, the old man's belly burst with a bang, and his intestines fell in the red-hot pot and immediately scurried like a snake. I'm sorry if this is too horrible to hear, but imagine that the people had to suffer through this and watch it happen right before their very eyes. This kind of cruelty is hard to maintain, though. So after the CCP successfully suppressed down the rebellion, it tried to create an impression that all ethnic groups can live in harmony, happiness, and freedom under the CCP's rule. However, the CCP's desire to control, enslave, and assimilate every ethnicity is too strong for itself to hold back its efforts to try to turn every group into its submissive slaves. If an ethnic group still has its own language, culture, and religion, that it can never become 100% slaves of the CCP. That's why, for decades, the CCP has been trying to marginalize and then eliminate other cultures and languages. And that's why we are seeing the latest round of the CCP's attempt to wipe out the Mongolia language. For the CCP, if something cannot be used or controlled by the party, it is useless and should certainly be wiped out. The danger is, after decades of suppression, brainwashing, and buying over, some people have become numb or accustomed to their situations, like frogs being boiled slowly in warm water. They no longer feel the danger until it is too late. If the CCP can successfully push down the protest and achieve its goal in southern Mongolia this time, I don't know what that would mean for the Mongolia culture and the Mongolia people. Many years ago, I was invited to speak at a human rights forum at the Western Sydney University in Australia. A Tibetan community leader was invited too. I remember after he talked about the human rights violations in the CCP-occupied Tibet, he said something like, quote, "Let's put China in the naughty corner," which means China should be punished for the atrocities suffered by Tibetans. After hearing him saying that, I stood up and said, "Can I make a suggestion? Can we say, put the CCP in the naughty corner instead of China?" Then I went on to say that the CCP was not only the enemy of Tibetan people and Tibetan culture, but also the enemy of Chinese people and Chinese culture. Only because the CCP also uses the Chinese language to do evil, many people failed to realize that the CCP has committed cultural genocide to Chinese people and Chinese culture. Why did I say that? If we only talk about the language itself, the CCP modified or simplified the Chinese characters in the 1950s. About 2,500 Chinese characters has been simplified and changed. As a result, the deep cultural connotation of the Chinese language has been lost. For example, the traditional Chinese character for love, "ai," has a Chinese word for heart, 心, in it. But the simplified Chinese character for the love no longer has the word heart in it. Can love without a heart still be love? Another example is the traditional Chinese word 亲. This word means family, dear, close, etc. In the process of simplification, half of the character 亲, which is 见, was cut off, with only half of the original character left. The cut off part means see, look, or meet. So people say that in CCP's China, families are no longer meant to see one another because the word see was cut off from the word for family. There are many other similar examples, and I'm afraid that I don't have time to talk about them all. The Chinese language is one of the most ancient, most profound, and yet most simple languages in the world. Though there are tens of thousands of Chinese characters in total, the most commonly used ones are only about 3,500 characters. So, out of the 3,500 characters, 2,500 were modified or simplified. Would you say that this language is still the original Chinese language? No, it has already been greatly altered beyond recognition. If we talk about the connotation of the Chinese language, the damage and alteration are even greater. Language doesn't exist alone or independently. Inside the language, there are culture, religion, values, traditions, and new expressions coming into being with new social development, new science, and technology. Ever since the CCP took power in China, it has been constantly eliminating or wiping out traditional Chinese culture and values, as well as religions. It rewrote and reinterpreted the Chinese history and simplified it into a history of class struggles, of the ruled class throwing out of the ruling class, and a process of preparing Chinese society for socialism and then ultimately communism. If we look at the history of China before the CCP, it was a history deeply embodied with spiritual pursuit. For thousands of years, Chinese people practiced Taoism, Buddhism, Confucianism, and pursued spiritual perfection or consummation. These have already been embodied in Chinese people's everyday life and everyday language. However, the CCP has barbarously eliminated almost all the real essence of Chinese culture and used its simplified Chinese characters to establish a party culture, a CCP culture that is full of violence, hatred, inadequacy, ugliness, and pursuit for material and desires only. For example, if you read ancient Chinese poems or novels, there were so many different ways to describe the beauty of the lady. Each of them had their own unique beauty, characteristic, and charms, and they lived vividly in your mind and imagination. However, nowadays, it seems that there is only one way left to describe a good-looking young lady, which is 颜值很高, which means she scores high with her appearance. Sometimes they also say 颜值能打 or 颜值吊打, 颜值碾压, which all mean that her appearance can beat that of others. So in other words, they mark the beauty of different human beings with the same kind of scoring system, and those who score higher have the right to look down upon or run over those who score lower. What kind of nonsense is that, right? And when they talk about young, handsome men, they call them 小鲜肉, which means young, fresh meat or young, fresh flesh. People are no longer referred to as human beings with a soul, but are reduced to a piece of meat or living, walking meat at most. This kind of ugly and disgusting language is everywhere on the internet, and young people use it every day without even feeling any issues with using it. If we were to discuss this further, there is so much more to explore, but I'm afraid that I wouldn't be able to cover everything even if I kept talking for days. So I'll stop here. All in all, in the latest cultural genocide in Inner or Southern Mongolia, I hope people can see one more time that the CCP is the real enemy of mankind. Chinese, Tibetans, Mongolians, Uyghurs, and many other ethnic groups are all victims of the CCP, and mankind should join forces to stop it before it can take more culture and human beings to destruction. That's all for today. Thank you for watching. Truth saves lives. Please subscribe to and share my channel and check out my other videos. Thank you. See you next time.